Akyam. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rakakadash. Double honors to the elder apostles of Great Millstone who teach and rule well, and Shalom to the sincere Akyam, spreading this truth and sincerity. Shalom. So in this video, I actually want to, speak on an example concerning how the transition, of basically Jake ruling during the Middle Ages, slowly but surely transitioning, into Esau, coming into rulership, man. Because we do know and understand that through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, combined with secular history, that the Dark Ages was a period of time in which Jake, the Israelites, the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, that we know in this day and age, basically those people, that they ruled, during the time period of roughly, 300 to, roughly 1300, 1500 AD, and actually both instances, how Jake, started to rule for those 1,000 years, but also how Jake was taken out, was a transitional instance in which at the start Jake started to basically infiltrate into the households of the elites and the rulerships, and became generals and eventually Caesars and governors, etc. And the same thing actually happened the moment that it was time for Jake to get out of rulership and for Esau to come back, to basically fulfill biblical prophecy, man. Wherein then Esau was brought into the houses, as servants, and then became generals, and what else do you have, like dukes and lords. And one of the examples that I actually want to speak upon is the series that can be watched, called Bridgerton. In that series, you see dukes and lords basically being in a higher position, seeing that they are dukes and lords, and even the queen, man. The queen in that series, she's either a Jake or she is a Thayer, but she is of a darker complexion. She's of a darker complexion. Therefore, we are able to establish that she's either a Jake or that she is a Thayer. So that means that her mother is an Israelite and her father, therefore, then is an Edomite. And that's basically an example of how these things went during that transitional phase, man. During that phase, which basically began in 1450, around 52, 54, when the Roman Empire got taken out of rulership, by Mehmed II from the Ottoman Empire. That was basically the start of Jake being taken out of rulership, and then slowly but surely the Heavenly Father made sure that transitional phase took place, where Esau got into the households, became generals and things like that. And what you see in that series is that you have Jake being dukes, being lords, and the example that I gave concerning the queen, she is basically of a darker skin complexion, But therefore I was like, hey, this is interesting. This is interesting because this is basically what happened, during that transitional phase, where you would have basically both nations basically playing their part simultaneously to basically construct that transitional phase, you know. And of course, that series Bridgerton takes place in the early 1800s, and slavery, took place in 1611. So it might not be really historically accurate, but the way that it took place, it gives us quite the example. So the example that I'm using right now is might not, according to the series itself, it might not be historically accurate, but it does give us an example of how these things basically played out. Because you have this one guy who was a Jake, his father is a Jake, dark skin, quote unquote. You would look at him as being like quote unquote more pure, and then his son is of a more lighter complexion. So you would think like, okay, so his mother might be either light skin or his mother is an Edomite. I haven't watched all them things, but what I was able to watch so far, it shows you that that basically you have these quote unquote interracial marriages, and that's basically what happened during that transitional phase that eventually made sure that Esau would come out on top, which started off after Mehmed II was able to bring down Constantine the 11th, man, because that was basically that end of the rulership of Jake, who had a similar way of establishing themselves around 200 to 300 AD, wherein they then was able to overtake the rulership of Esau and basically intermingle themselves and come into power through these marriages, through taking that power, so that that transition will be able to take place, And like I said, I haven't watched the whole thing, but a couple of characters that I've seen, they're Jakes, amongst Esau, playing their part in a series that takes place at the early 1800s. Basically, that time period being called the Renaissance. And it's quite interesting to look at it, with a spiritual eye, because then you understand, like, okay, so this is basically how it went. These lords, these dukes, these princes, these princesses, marrying for basically power, wealth, establishment, like very political way of dealing with marriage, a very political way of dealing with marriage, and I also have to pay attention to the road, by the way, because it's snowing again. The roads are, a little bit mushed up, so I'm kind of curious as to how this is going to play out for tomorrow. Seeing the weather is mushed up, but hey, it is what it is. Point of the matter is that that series is a very interesting watch. I don't know whether I'm going to finish it, because still it is like how you say it is. It's like a fantasy type of thing. It's a fantasy type of thing, and it's not really based, upon historical accuracy. You know what I mean? Because if I'm correct, those people in there are not even, the true people that lived back in those days. But I've not done too much research on that series, because I just watched it and it was like, it's an interesting thing to bring out. But that's basically how these things went, man. You know, interracial marriages, to say it like that, wherein Esau eventually came out on top, just like how Jake, you know, got on top, you know, at the start of the Dark Ages, which the Dark Ages is also, you know, signifying that it was ruled by dark-skinned people. You know, and like I mentioned, the Israelites are the, you know, so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. But the majority of the Israelites that basically ruled during the Dark Ages were the so-called Negroes. You know, because the Northern Kingdom, you know, which that consists mainly of the so-called Latinos and so-called Native Americans, they already was in America. You know, Arstered, Achar Haratazak. You know, the place where the Heavenly Father already foretold that they would eventually be in those latter days. You know, and where they are still at right now. You know, waiting for our return and, you know, basically our former captivity, our former state, you know, of being, you know, the former state that we used to be in as a people, which was unified, you know, under the banner of Yashar Allah. You know, because like I said, the Dark Ages, even though they was ruled by Israelites, you know, it was not under the banner of, you know, Yashar Allah. It was under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire, which there was nothing holy about it, you know. But yeah, you know. So yeah, like I said, it's an interesting watch. I haven't seen a lot, but to get an idea of how these things went, it's still interesting to look at it, man. You know, wealthy people, you know, people of power, esteem, that are in a certain position. You see Jake in there. You see Esau in there, you know, so it's interesting to see and look at it as an example, you know, of how these things went, you know, not to look at it as like historically accurate, you know, because we know that these, because there's a certain term for these type of series, because it's like cosplay type of things, right, with the dresses, with the clothing. You know, and it is often very romanticized instead of, you know, being biblically or historically accurate, right? You see, so hey, with that, I do hope and pray that this video was edifying. And with that, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rakakodash. Double honors to the elder apostles of Great Millstone, teach and rule well. And shalom to the sincere Akim, spreading the truth and sincerity. Shalom.